The year is 1710. In the city of Tallinn, on the Baltic coast, Russian cannons surround the Swedish fortress. Peter the Great's armies have marched across Europe. They've conquered, they've occupied, they've absorbed entire nations into the Russian Empire. Now they want Estonia. The Swedish garrison surrenders on October 10th, 1710. The Russian flag rises over Tallinn's medieval walls. This is the beginning of Russian rule in Estonia. It will last 208 years. Then, in 1940, the Soviets invade. Another 50 years of Russian control. Combined, over 250 years of Russian domination. That's longer than the United States has existed as a nation. Here's what should have happened. Russian settlers arrive. Russian becomes the language. Russian DNA mixes with local DNA. Estonian identity fades. The people become Russian. That's what happened to dozens of other conquered peoples throughout history. But in Estonia, something different occurred. Today, in 2026, if you take a DNA test as an Estonian, here's what you find. Your DNA is not Russian. It's Finno-Ugric, from Siberia, from 3,000 years ago. You speak Estonian, a language unrelated to Russian, unrelated to any neighbouring language, unrelated to anything except Finnish and Hungarian. You share more genetic markers with people in Finland, 80 kilometres across the sea, than with Russians who lived next door for over 250 years. How? How does a nation survive 700 years of foreign conquest, Danish, German, Swedish, Russian, and emerge with its DNA unchanged? This is the Estonia DNA mystery. The story of the nation that wouldn't disappear. To understand how Estonians survived, we need to understand where they came from. Because Estonian DNA tells a story that starts not in Europe, but in Asia. 5,000 years ago, deep in the Ural Mountains, the border between Europe and Asia, a group of people lived as hunter-gatherers. They spoke a language completely different from the Indo-European tongues spreading across Europe. No Latin roots, no Germanic structure, no Slavic grammar. Something older, something stranger. Finno-Ugric. Around 1800 BC, the early Bronze Age, these Uralic-speaking peoples began to migrate. Not south into the civilizations of Mesopotamia or Egypt, not west into the farmlands of Europe, north and west, into the forests, into the cold. The migration split into three main branches. One group moved northwest to the forests of Finland. They became the Finns. Another group stayed on the Baltic coast. They became the Estonians. A third group migrated southwest across the steppes to the Pannonian Plain. They became the Hungarians. Three peoples, separated by thousands of kilometres, yet genetically connected by a single ancient journey. The evidence is in the DNA. Modern Estonians carry 34 to 36% of the N1C haplogroup, a Y chromosome marker that originated in East Eurasia. It's the Finno-Ugric signature. You find it in Finns at 61%, in Hungarians at 15 to 20%, in the Volga-Ural peoples, the Mari, Komi, Udmurt, at 50 to 67%, Latvians 38%, N1C, Lithuanians 42%. But Latvia and Lithuania speak Baltic languages, Indo-European languages related to Sanskrit, Latin and Russian. Estonia doesn't. Estonia speaks a Finno-Ugric language, and the DNA matches the language. So when did this Finno-Ugric genetic signature actually arrive in Estonia? For decades, archaeologists debated this. Then, in 2019, geneticists at the University of Tartu analysed DNA from ancient Estonian skeletons. Bronze Age burials, 1200 to 1400 BC. Iron Age burials, 500 BC to 50 AD. The results were stunning. In Bronze Age skeletons, there was no Siberian genetic component, no N1C dominance. The people buried in Bronze Age stone cist graves were genetically Western, more Scandinavian influenced. But in Iron Age tarand graves, pit burials from around 500 BC onward, the Siberian component appears. N1C, the Finno-Ugric marker. And it arrived from the east, the Volga-Ural region, the same place the modern Mari, Komi and Udmurt peoples still live today. This matches perfectly with the linguistic evidence. Estonian, Finnish and Hungarian all share the same language family structure. No grammatical gender. Extensive case systems. Estonian has 14 cases, Finnish has 15, Hungarian has 18. Agglutination, building words by stacking suffixes. The word for fish in Estonian is kala, in Finnish, kala, in Hungarian, hal. The word for eye in Estonian is silm, in Finnish, silmä, in Hungarian, sem. Different but recognisably related. Compare that to Estonian's neighbours. Latvian for fish, zivs. Lithuanian, žuvis. Russian, riba. Completely unrelated. So by 500 BC, the genetic and linguistic foundation of Estonia was established. Finno-Ugric speaking peoples, carrying N1C haplogroups, had settled the Baltic coast. They built fortified settlements, Asva and Ridala on the island of Saaremaa, Iru in northern Estonia. They developed maritime trade, bronze metalworking, shipbuilding. They lived in relative isolation for over 1,000 years. And then the Crusaders came. June 15th, 1219. A fleet of Danish longships approaches the Estonian coast. King Valdemar II of Denmark has answered the Pope's call for a northern crusade. The target? Pagan Estonia. The Danes land at a place called Lindenius, a small Estonian settlement on the northern coast. They build a stone fortress, Castrum Danorum, the Danish castle. The Estonians call it Tarnilin, town of the Danes. Today we know it as Tallinn. The Estonian warriors gather. They negotiate, playing for time, assembling an army. Then, after supper time on June 15th, they attack from 5 directions. The Danes are caught by surprise. They flee. Bishop Theodoric is killed. The Estonians think he's the king. It looks like an Estonian victory. But the Danish Wendish vassals launch a counterattack. The Estonian advance stops. According to legend, at that moment a red flag with a white cross falls from the sky, the Dannebrog, Denmark's future national flag. The Danes rally. They push the Estonians back. Valdemar II claims victory. Northern Estonia becomes Danish territory. But here's what's crucial for our DNA story. The Danes didn't colonise Estonia, they ruled it. There's a difference. Colonisation means settlers arrive, intermarry, mix populations. The conquered become genetically absorbed. Rule means a foreign elite controls the territory, while the local population remains separate. The Danes built castles in cities. They installed bishops. They collected taxes. But the Estonian peasants stayed in their villages, spoke Estonian, married other Estonians. No genetic mixing. The Danish nobility didn't marry Estonian farmers. Medieval Europe had rigid class structures. Nobles married nobles, peasants married peasants. So for 127 years, 1219 to 1346, Estonia was politically Danish, but genetically Estonian. Then, in 1346, Denmark sold northern Estonia to the Teutonic Order for 19,000 Cologne marks. The Teutonic Knights. German crusading monks. Warriors of God. They had already conquered southern Estonia in 1227, after defeating the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. Now they controlled all of Estonia. From 1346 to 1561, 215 years, Estonia was ruled by German knights. This is when Baltic German nobility became the ruling class. German became the language of cities, trade and administration. Tallinn joined the Hanseatic League. Tartu became a centre of Baltic German culture. But again, the German elite ruled the cities. The Estonian peasants worked the land. Marriage between Germans and Estonians was virtually non-existent. The Germans considered themselves a separate, superior class. So genetically, Estonia remained Estonian. The genetic data proves it. Modern Estonians have minimal Germanic genetic markers. Some I1 haplogroup, around 15%, but much of that likely comes from later Swedish rule, not from the Teutonic period. Why? Because class segregation prevented genetic mixing. The Estonians lived in their own communities, spoke their own language at home, maintained their own marriage networks. They became serfs, legally bound to the land, forbidden to leave without permission. But serfdom, paradoxically, protected Estonian genetic identity. Serfs couldn't migrate, they couldn't integrate into German society. They remained isolated in Estonian-speaking villages. So for over 300 years of Danish and German rule, Estonian DNA stayed Estonian. Then, in 1561, everything changed. The Teutonic Order collapsed during the Livonian War. Russia invaded from the east. Ivan the Terrible wanted the Baltic coast. Poland-Lithuania pushed in from the south. And Sweden, emerging as a Baltic power, sailed in from the north. Northern Estonia, desperate for protection against Russian invasion, voluntarily submitted to Swedish King Eric XIV in June 1561. Sweden would rule Estonia for the next 149 years. And unlike the Danes and Germans, the Swedes actually tried to improve life for Estonian peasants. King Gustavus II Adolphus forced the nobility to grant rural Estonians greater autonomy. In 1632, the University of Tartu was founded, the first university in the Baltic region. A network of village schools was created in the 1620s. Literacy was promoted. Estonians today call this period the good old Swedish times. But genetically, the same pattern held. Swedish nobles ruled. Estonian peasants farmed. Minimal intermarriage. The 15% 1-1 haplogroup in modern Estonians likely reflects some Swedish genetic contribution, but it's small. Much smaller than 149 years of rule would suggest, if there had been significant population mixing. Why? Same reason as before, class separation. And then, in 1700, the Great Northern War began. Peter the Great of Russia wanted the Baltic provinces. Sweden's young king, Charles XII, fought brilliantly at first. He crushed the Russian army at the Battle of Narva in 1700. But the war dragged on for 21 years. By 1710, plague ravaged the Swedish Baltic provinces. The population was weakened, starving. Russian forces besieged Riga in November 1709. The city fell in July 1710. Tallinn surrendered on October 10, 1710. The Swedish period was over. The Russian period had begun. And this is where the DNA story becomes truly remarkable. 208 years. That's how long the Russian Empire ruled Estonia. To put that in perspective, that's longer than the entire history of the United States from independence to today. 8 generations of Estonians were born, lived and died under Russian rule. So here's the question that haunts geneticists. Why didn't Estonians become Russian? Because typically, 208 years of imperial rule changes a population's DNA. Minimal Russian genetic markers. The R1A-Z280 subclade, the Russian-specific variant of R1A, appears in Estonians at very low frequencies. Endogamy means marrying within your own group. When Peter the Great conquered Estonia, he made a strategic decision. He left the Baltic German nobility in power. The capitulation of Estonia in 1710 granted the German nobles and the Protestant Church extraordinary privileges. They could keep their estates, their laws, their language, their religion. Why did Peter do this? Because he needed the Baltic Germans to run the territory efficiently. Russia had just won a brutal 21-year war. Peter didn't have the resources to impose a completely new administrative system. So he made a deal. The Baltic Germans would stay in charge. They'd remain loyal to the Russian crown. In exchange, they'd keep their power. This created a 3-tier system. The Baltic Germans spoke German at home, married other Baltic Germans, and saw themselves as culturally superior to both Russians and Estonians. The Russians spoke Russian, administered the empire, and didn't mix much with local populations. The Estonian peasants spoke Estonian at home, worked the land, and were legally bound as serfs until 1816. This 3-tier segregation prevented genetic mixing. An Estonian farmer couldn't marry a Baltic German noblewoman. Class barriers were absolute. An Estonian farmer wouldn't marry a Russian administrator. Cultural and linguistic barriers were too strong. So Estonians married other Estonians. But there's more to the story. Even after the abolition of serfdom in 1816, when Estonians theoretically had more freedom to move and integrate, they didn't. Why? Because language became a fortress. In the mid-1800s, the Estonian national awakening began. Estonian intellectuals, the first university-educated Estonians, started promoting Estonian language and identity. The first nationwide song festival took place in 1869 in Tartu. Thousands gathered to sing in Estonian. This wasn't just cultural, it was resistance. By maintaining the Estonian language, Estonians maintained marriage networks. An Estonian-speaking woman wouldn't marry a Russian-speaking man. They couldn't communicate, couldn't share culture, couldn't raise children in a common language. Language created reproductive isolation. And reproductive isolation preserved DNA. The Russian Empire tried to change this. In the 1880s, Tsar Alexander III launched a Russification campaign. Estonian language schools were closed. Russian became the mandatory language of instruction. Estonian publications were censored. Russian orthodoxy was promoted over Lutheranism. The goal? Make Estonians Russian. But it failed. Because Estonians spoke Estonian at home. They taught their children Estonian in secret. They maintained Lutheran churches where Estonian was spoken. And when they chose spouses, they chose other Estonian speakers. Then came World War I. The Russian Empire collapsed in 1917. Estonia declared independence on February 24th, 1918. For 22 years, 1918 to 1940, Estonia was free. A land reform distributed Baltic German estates to Estonian farmers. Estonian became the official language. Estonian culture flourished. The university at Tartu became a centre of Estonian intellectual life, and Estonians married Estonians at even higher rates than before. Because now they had a nation, an identity, a reason to preserve what they'd protected for centuries. But in 1940, the Soviets came. Stalin's pact with Hitler carved up Eastern Europe. On June 17, 1940, Soviet troops marched into Estonia. The country was occupied. And this occupation would last, with a brief German interruption from 1941 to 1944, until 1991. 50 years. The Soviets tried what the Russians had failed to do. They deported Estonian intellectuals, over 60,000 people killed or deported in the first year alone. They imported Russian settlers to dilute the Estonian population. They made Russian the language of advancement. If you wanted a good job, you spoke Russian. They built Russian-speaking neighbourhoods in Tallinn, created Russian schools, promoted intermarriage. And here's the remarkable thing. It still didn't work. Even under brutal Soviet occupation, Estonians refused to genetically integrate. Why? Same reason as always, linguistic endogamy. Estonians spoke Estonian at home. Russian might be the language of work, of official business, of survival. But at home, Estonian. And when young Estonians chose partners, they chose other Estonian speakers. There were Russian-Estonian marriages, of course. Some cultural mixing did occur. But the rate was far lower than what the Soviets expected. Because language created walls that even totalitarianism couldn't fully break down. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Estonia regained independence on August 20th, 1991. And when geneticists started studying Estonian DNA in the 2000s and 2010s, they found something astonishing. After over 250 years of Russian and Soviet rule, Estonian DNA was still predominantly Finno-Ugric, still 34 to 36% N1C, still closer to Finland than to Russia, still the same genetic profile as the Iron Age tarand graves. The nation had survived. Modern genetic studies tell the story clearly. When researchers analyse Estonian DNA today, here's what they find. Y chromosome haplogroups patrilineal, N1C 34 to 36%, the Finno-Ugric marker from Siberia. R1A 32 to 34%, but not the Russian variant. Instead, variants shared with Balts and Scandinavians. 1-1, 15%, Scandinavian marker, likely from Swedish period. Other haplogroups, approximately 15%. Mitochondrial DNA, matrilineal. Haplogroup H, 45 to 48%, common European. Haplogroup U, 24%, ancient European hunter-gatherer. Others, approximately 27%. Autosomal DNA, overall ancestry. Estonians cluster genetically closest to Finns, despite Finns being 80 kilometres away across the Baltic Sea. Then to Latvians and Lithuanians, immediate neighbours. But they're genetically distinct from Russians, despite over 250 years of rule. Estonians carry about 5% Siberian-related ancestry, higher than Balts, lower than Finns. This Siberian component is crucial. It's what distinguishes Estonians from their Baltic neighbours. This suggests multiple waves of Finno-Ugric migration, with different groups carrying different N1C variants. Modern Estonia provides a natural experiment in genetic resistance. The country has a significant Russian-speaking minority, about 25% of the population. These are mostly descendants of Soviet-era settlers. Genetic studies show limited mixing between Estonian speakers and Russian speakers, even today. They live in the same country, the same cities, often the same neighbourhoods. But marriage rates between the two groups remain relatively low. Why? Language, culture, identity. This is how Estonia's DNA stayed Estonian through 700 years of foreign rule. Not through isolation, Estonians traded with Germans, fought alongside Swedes, lived under Russian administration, but through linguistic endogamy. By maintaining their language, they maintained their marriages within the group. By maintaining marriages within the group, they maintained their genetic identity. The DNA doesn't lie. Modern Estonians are genetically continuous with the Iron Age tarand graves from 500 BC. 3,000 years of genetic preservation. Through Danish crusades, German knights, Swedish Empire, Russian colonization, Soviet occupation. The nation that wouldn't disappear. Today, Estonia is a small nation. 1.3 million people. About the size of a mid-sized American city. But those 1.3 million people carry a genetic heritage that stretches back 3,000 years. They speak a language that connects them to ancient Siberian migrations. They share DNA with Finns across the Baltic and Hungarians across Europe, peoples they've never politically united with, but who speak cousin languages and carry cousin genes. And they've proven something remarkable. Empires can conquer territory. They can rule for centuries. They can impose languages, religions, laws. But they can't change DNA if the people refuse to change. Estonia survived because Estonians built a fortress, not of stone, but of language.